International news and comment live from Moscow. This is RT with me, Yulia Shapovalova. Thanks for joining us. The US military is sending 7 more forces to surround Syria in anticipation of a first strike order from Washington. Congress will reconvene in a week's time to debate whether to attack Damascus, but Barack Obama has made it clear he may order an assault even without the agreement of lawmakers. American defense officials have confirmed that an aircraft carrier group is now on its way to the region. The nuclear-powered USS Nimitz, carrying dozens of aircraft, is accompanied by 5 smaller warships armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles. The strike group is expected to team up with several ships already in the position in the Mediterranean off the Syrian coast. The combined fleet could pummel Damascus from a safe distance, dealing massive damage to the country. Maria Finoshna has the reaction from the Syrian capital.
Tomorrow, next week, next month? Syria is wondering if or when America's missiles will strike and what the aftermath will be. But for many people here, it doesn't pay to linger on what tomorrow will bring, because there is already a war, today.
We've been at war for 2 years with bombs falling on our heads just a few kilometers from here. Cruise missiles or rebels, what is the difference?
Every day, every hour, every minute, we endure bombardment. We have bombs and terror attacks, shelling. It's not very hard to face America after dealing with the jihadists for so long.
Mashal Walid, not his real name, has a nice apartment in an upmarket area of Damascus. But a year ago, he moved into the hotel he's running for safety reasons after a family member was kidnapped by what he says were members of an al-Qaeda-linked group.
We don't feel safe, of course, not because of the strike. We've got Jabhat al-Nusra. They are throwing these things against us here, civilians, and that's very bad.
Jabhat al-Nusra is considered to be one of the most successful and aggressive opposition forces, promoting fundamental Islam and proclaiming the end of the Assad regime. They are believed to hold several districts around Damascus, where they engage in almost daily battles with government troops. Both the UN and the US, among others, consider it a terrorist organization.
Actually, I think that America should side us because we are fighting terrorism.
America doesn't agree.
I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets.
That's just another entry on a long list of daily concerns, which already includes terror attacks, kidnappings and killings.
Those living in residential areas of Damascus say several days ago they started receiving letters like this one, advising them to clear their basements in preparation.
For now, no one I spoke to looked like they would follow the advice. Syrians may vote with their feet when the bombs start to fall. But for now, they've got plenty of other things to worry about. Maria Finoshna, RT, reporting from Damascus in Syria.
British firms recently sold Syria chemicals which can be used to make nerve gas, the agent allegedly used during last month's deadly attack near Damascus. It's been revealed that London granted export licenses last January when Syria was already ravaged by civil war. Let's now get the latest from RT's Sarah Firth. She joins us now live from London. Sarah, nice to see you. So has the government explained why it allowed those chemical substances to be sold to Syria?
Well, Business Secretary Vince Cable's certainly going to be facing some tough questions over these revelations that the British government had granted export licenses to an as yet unnamed British company. Now, this was for substances to be sent to Syria, and it was for 2 so-called dual-use substances, and that was potassium fluoride and sodium fluoride, and both those agents can be used as precursor chemicals in the manufacture of nerve gas. Now, those export licenses granted by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, it's reported in January the 17th and 18th, and that license valid for 6 months in 2012, as you mentioned, when the civil war in Syria was already raging. And so huge concerns over the fact that those export licenses were ever granted in the first place, and some big questions remaining. Now, the department has come back and said that it had assessed over whether there was a risk that could be used for internal repression. They said that they felt the export license was correctly granted, and that also they'd accepted assurances from the exporting company that these chemicals could be used for the manufacture of window frames in industrial processes. But as we said, those chemicals can also be used as precursor chemicals in the creation of the types of nerve agents that we've seen the British government accusing the Syrian government of having used on its own people. And certainly now some huge outstanding questions remain as to how this export license was ever granted in the first place, and indeed if it was the only one granted.
So, as you say, these chemicals have already been sold and possibly used to manufacture chemical weapons. But what kind of ramifications could that have, given the US intention to strike?
Well, the Department for Business Skills, Innovation and Skills has actually said that though the export licenses were granted, those chemical agents never actually making it to Syria, because, of course, 6 months later you then had the EU sanctions tightening, and so those licenses were then revoked. But critics of the Business Secretary are saying that that was simply by chance, that those chemicals never actually made it there. And again, as we said, huge questions surrounding the fact that these licenses were ever granted. These revelations coming on the back, of course, of the US saying they've got further evidence that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons against the Syrian people. There's huge concern anyway about the suspected chemical weapons stockpiles in the country. I think we've got a map of some of the suspected sites there. Of course, huge concern about what the Syrian government could potentially be doing with those chemical weapons, but of course also that some of those sites where it thought there are chemical weapons stockpiles could fall into the wrong hands as the situation gets ever more complex on the ground in that country. But it's thought here today there are going to be questions tabled in Parliament to really run through and scrutinise exactly how these licences for chemical weapons, for chemical agents that could be used in the types of weapons that the Syrian government are being accused of using on their own people, were granted for a British company to send to Syria.
All right, Artie Sarah, live from London. Sarah, thank you very much indeed for that. We appreciate it. Thank you. The White House is chasing ghosts by building a case for war in Syria based on inconclusive evidence. That's according to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who reiterated the Kremlin's stance against intervention without UN backing. Artie's Sean Thomas has more.
This is the first statement from Russian leadership after Obama's speech on Saturday. And at first, he made some broad, sweeping statements about Western policy in the Middle East, saying that it's inconsistent and that there are double standards. But speaking on the idea of the United States having evidence that it was the Assad regime that used chemical weapons in Syria, he said that that evidence is not concrete. It does not give specifics. It does not give locations. It does not talk about specific people or places. Therefore, Russia is skeptical. Let's listen to what he had to say about that.
As we believe, we've seen these papers, there is no evidence. There's just accusations. If you have really any super secret data, well, you need to remove these secrets, because we're talking about war and peace.
Now, one thing Lavrov did talk about was the situation in Aleppo, Syria, back in March, where the Russian government believes they have evidence that it was the Syrian rebels, the opposition, that actually used chemical weapons. They pointed to the fact that the ordnance used to deliver the sarin gas were not manufactured by mass, and also that the gas itself was not industrially produced, therefore pointing to the fact that it was the opposition that used chemicals. At that time, they wanted to have an investigation. They were willing to cooperate. They were ready to move forward. And Lavrov said that it was the Western partners on the UN Security Council that delayed. They didn't seem interested in having an investigation at that time, perhaps because it was the rebels that were in question here. So today, Sergei Lavrov reiterating Russia's stance and strongly against the idea of Western intervention.
So, as we've just heard from Sean, the US is building a case for war on its own claims and intelligence. And Washington has also pointed to amateur footage posted online allegedly showing victims of the attack. Even unconfirmed accounts by reported eyewitnesses are being used as solid evidence by America, while the latest claims from the State Department revolve around alleged samples from the war zone, which they say confirm the use of chemical weapons. But most of America's allies aren't buying the arguments, with only France agreeing to weigh in with force to support a US attack, while the UN says it is the only one who can determine whether chemical weapons were actually used.
The United Nations mission is uniquely capable of establishing in an impartial and credible manner the facts of any use of chemical weapons based directly on evidence collected from the ground. Okay.
And has the U.S. shared any of this evidence that is described with the UN?
Well, as we've repeatedly said, member states are encouraged to share information they may have with regard to alleged incidents.
The US has been accused of overlooking some facts that undermine its view of how the region should be dealt with. RT's Anastasia Churkina looks now at claims that Washington rarely lets inconsistency get in the way.
The use of chemical weapons on August 21st, killing hundreds of people with an ongoing UN investigation, is now the anchor to weigh a more direct involvement and the option of a military escapade. But this is far from the first time chemical weapons have come up in the conflict, although incidents which are apparently less convenient for the US to pay attention to. One example, in May this year, a top UN investigator said a chemical attack with the use of sarin gas had taken place in March, with indications that it was done by the opposition forces.
Our investigators have been in Syria and in neighboring countries, interview victims, doctors and field hospitals. And in the latest report we got last week, I saw that although there is still no incontrovertible proof, there are very strong suspicions, judging by the kind of medical help the victims received, that sarin gas has been used by the opposition, rebels, and not the country's authorities. But it's not surprising, because militants and people from outside have already infiltrated the opposition.
From ignoring the reports of UN investigators it would rather kept quiet, to turning a blind eye to the fate of Kurds, the largest ethnic minority in Syria, at the hands of the opposition, leading to the displacement of tens of thousands of people.
Our people, our villagers, suffer vicious assaults. They're chased out of their homes. They become victims of massacres and ethnic cleansing. Everything connected to the Kurds is being destroyed.
To episodes of finding sarin gas in the homes of Syrian militants reportedly to be used for bombs in May this year, when Russia and Turkey called for an investigation, but the West did not. Questionable and uncomfortable factors have been downplayed by the U.S. time after time. A possible end to the Syrian crisis is as far away as ever, but misinformation and selective reasoning seem to be alive and well. Anastasia Churkina, RT, Moscow.
The Arab League is split over the Syrian issue. Saudi Arabia and Qatar calling for decisive action, which they say would prevent bloodshed continuing. Iraq, however, which has suffered an intervention from US forces, is strongly against. The Iraqi Prime Minister urged Washington not to resort to military action again. Lebanon, Tunisia and Algeria also spoke out against foreign intervention. The leaders of Britain and France support Barack Obama, although the British Parliament voted to stop its forces from being directly involved. And now attention is on the US Congress, which is expected to respond to President Obama's request for support next week.
I think it is right on these vital issues.
And coming up here on RT, 1,000 days staring at walls. That's the fate of WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange,